They often assert that justice is blind. However, within the confines of the Metropolitan Police Department, it had morphed into something far more sinister, corrupted, calculated, and merciless. For many years, a covert network of officers had mastered the art of dismantling lives under the pretense of authority, training new recruits to perceive threats where none existed. They believed they had discovered the ideal candidate in Officer Savannah Mitchell, young, ambitious, and eager to absorb their playbook. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, she apprehended Darnell Washington. She perceived what she wished to see, just another target, another statistic. What she failed to recognize was that this singular action would thrust her before Judge Marcus Carter, the very judge who had transformed his own wrongful imprisonment into a masterclass on exposing police corruption. He was referred to as the Scale, because in his courtroom, justice was not merely blind, it was inevitable. Now, as her meticulously constructed world disintegrates under the weight of video evidence, Officer Mitchell is about to discover why corrupt officers still murmur his name when cases arrive on his desk. Before we dive back into the story, I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. And if you are enjoying these narratives, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you absolutely do not want to overlook. Officer Savannah Mitchell adjusted her freshly pressed uniform in the rearview mirror of her patrol vehicle, admiring how the morning sun glinted off her newly affixed badge. The parking lot of the Metropolitan Police Department was already bustling with activity as officers arrived for the morning shift, but she had come early, not out of eagerness to learn from her superiors, but to demonstrate that she was already a step ahead. It was her first day on solo patrol, and she muttered to herself, practicing the confident smile she had honed over 4 months of field training. It was time to show them what genuine police work looked like. As she strode through the precinct doors, several experienced officers nodded in acknowledgement. Sergeant Thompson, a seasoned man with salt and pepper hair and 23 years of service, stepped away from the coffee machine to intercept her. "Mitchell," he called out, his tone heavy with the weight of experience. "Got a minute before the briefing?" Savannah's smile remained intact, even as she internally battled the urge to roll her eyes. "Of course, Sergeant," she replied, her voice sweet yet laced with resolve. Thompson gestured to a quiet corner of the break room. "Look, I know you're eager to get out there, but remember what we discussed during training. This isn't River Creek anymore. The city is different, more intricate. Take time to learn the neighborhoods and understand the community." "With all due respect, Sergeant," Savannah interjected, her smile tightening, "I graduated at the top of my class at the academy. I believe I can manage whatever comes my way." The memory of her father's words echoed in her mind. A badge signifies authority, and authority commands respect. Thompson's expression hardened slightly. "That's precisely the attitude I'm concerned about, Mitchell. This job isn't merely about the badge." Just then, the briefing room door swung open, and Lieutenant Chen's voice resonated throughout the precinct. "Roll call in 5, Thompson said, cutting their conversation short. But Savannah was already walking away, her boots clicking purposefully against the linoleum floor. The briefing room filled quickly with the usual morning chaos, officers exchanging stories from the night shift, rookies comparing notes, and veterans claiming their usual seats. Savannah chose a spot in the front row, pulling out her notebook more for show than necessity. She had already memorized all the standard protocols and procedures. Lieutenant Chen commenced the briefing with routine updates, a series of car break-ins in the South District, a warning regarding a new drug circulating in local clubs, and updates on ongoing investigations. Then she paused, her expression turning serious. "One more thing before assignments," Chen announced. "Judge Marcus Carter is presiding over several of our cases this month. Those of you who've been here a while know him. He's fair but extremely meticulous. He expects everything to be by the book. No shortcuts, no assumptions. Ensure your paperwork is flawless." A few veteran officers nodded knowingly. Savannah jotted down the judge's name, though privately she dismissed the warning. Paperwork was merely paperwork, and a judge was just a judge. She had dealt with plenty of authority figures in her life. As assignments were handed out, Savannah received her patrol route, a mixed residential and commercial area that some officers deemed challenging due to its diverse population and complex community dynamics. To her, it was an opportunity to prove herself. The morning passed swiftly as Savannah familiarized herself with her beat. She handled a shoplifting call with what she considered appropriate sternness, issued 3 traffic tickets, and diffused a heated argument between neighbors before it could escalate. Each interaction reinforced her belief in her own capabilities. It was early afternoon when the call came in, possible disturbance at Marshall Street and 4th. The dispatcher's voice crackled through her radio, male subject reportedly acting suspiciously near the convenience store. "Copy that," Savannah responded immediately, already turning her patrol car toward the location. Unit 247 responding. Upon arrival, the scene appeared deceptively ordinary. A young black man in business casual attire standing near the store entrance, checking his phone. Darnell Washington had no idea that his life was about to intersect with Savannah's in a manner that would irrevocably alter both their futures. Savannah approached with her hand resting casually on her utility belt, her stance broadcasting authority. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the entrance." Darnell looked up from his phone, surprised. "Excuse me?" "We received reports of suspicious activity," Savannah stated, her voice carrying the clipped tones she had practiced to command respect. "What's your business here?" "I'm waiting for my sister," Darnell replied, maintaining his composure despite his growing confusion. "She works at the dental office next door. We're meeting for lunch." Savannah's eyes narrowed. The answer was perfectly reasonable, yet something in her bristled at his calm demeanor. In her mind, compliance equated to nervous deference. "I'm going to need to see some ID." "May I ask why?" Darnell's question was polite but direct. "I'm just standing here." "Sir, are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" Savannah took a step closer, her hand tightening on her belt. "No, I'm simply asking. Hands where I can see them." Savannah's voice rose sharply, drawing the attention of passers-by. Some pulled out their phones, sensing the situation was deteriorating. What transpired next would be debated in detail in the days to come. Savannah would claim Darnell made a sudden movement. Video evidence would later show him slowly reaching for his wallet, clearly stating his intentions. But in that moment, Savannah saw what she expected to see, what her preconceived notions told her to see. Minutes later, Darnell Washington found himself in handcuffs, charged with resisting arrest, while bystanders recorded the incident on their phones. His sister emerged from the dental office to find him being placed in the back of a patrol car, her lunch break transformed into a nightmare. Back at the precinct, Savannah filed her report with confident flourishes, crafting a narrative that portrayed herself as a vigilant officer and Darnell as an uncooperative subject who had escalated a routine interaction. She barely noticed the concerned glances from her colleagues as she described the incident in the break room. "Had to show him how we handle things in the city," she boasted, oblivious to the way Thompson and Chen exchanged worried looks. "Can't let them think they can just ignore an officer's commands." Meanwhile, across town, Darnell's mother, Patricia Washington, sat in the modest office of Marcus Williams, a local defense attorney known for handling civil rights cases. Her hands trembled as she recounted the phone call she had received from her daughter. "My son has never been in trouble," Patricia insisted, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "He's an accountant, Mr. Williams. He was just waiting for his sister to go to lunch." Marcus Williams listened intently, his expression growing more concerned as he reviewed the preliminary report and witness statements on his tablet. "The arresting officer is Savannah Mitchell," he noted, "new to the force, it seems." "Does that help us?" Patricia asked hopefully. "It might," Marcus replied carefully, "especially since this case has been assigned to Judge Carter's court." Across the city, in his chambers, Judge Marcus Carter was already reviewing the day's cases when Darnell Washington's file crossed his desk. The judge's dark eyes moved methodically over the report, his decades of experience allowing him to spot the subtle inconsistencies, the places where the narrative felt too neat, too rehearsed. He paused on Officer Mitchell's name, noting it was her first solo arrest. Something about the language in her report caught his attention, the way she emphasized her authority and Darnell's perceived defiance while glossing over the actual sequence of events. "Ms. Carson," he called to his clerk, "please pull Officer Mitchell's training records and any available footage from this incident. I think we need to examine this one closely." The next morning, as Savannah strutted through the precinct, sharing her version of events with anyone who would listen, she remained oblivious to the gathering storm. She dismissed a senior officer's attempted advice about proper escalation procedures and laughed off another's suggestion that she might want to review her body cam footage before the hearing. "Trust me," she said, leaning back in her chair during lunch break. "Once Judge Carter sees how I handled that situation, he'll understand we can't let people think they can just question our authority whenever they feel like it." "Mitchell," Sergeant Thompson tried one last time. "Judge Carter isn't—" I know," she waved him off. "He's thorough, he's fair, he expects everything by the book, but at the end of the day, he'll understand that I'm just doing my job, keeping the street safe." As she spoke those words, Judge Carter was settling into his chambers, preparing for what would become one of the most significant cases of his career. On his desk lay two files: Darnell Washington's spotless record and Officer Savannah Mitchell's incident report. Between them sat a USB drive containing multiple angles of video footage that told a very different story than the one Savannah had written. The judge thought back to his own youth, to moments when authority had been wielded as a weapon rather than a responsibility. He pulled out his legal pad and began making notes, preparing for a hearing that would test not just one rookie officer's arrogance, but the very foundations of justice and accountability in his courtroom. The stage was set. In 48 hours, Officer Savannah Mitchell would stand in Judge Carter's courtroom, armed with nothing but her misplaced confidence and a fabricated narrative. She had no way of knowing that her first solo arrest would become a pivotal moment, not only in her career, but also in the ongoing national conversation about power, prejudice, and the true meaning of justice. As the sun set over the city, three individuals prepared for the impending storm in vastly different ways. Darnell Washington sat in his mother's living room, surrounded by family, trying to maintain his faith in a system that had already failed him once. Judge Carter worked late into the night, meticulously reviewing precedents and procedures, aware that what was coming would require all of his experience and wisdom. And Savannah Mitchell returned home to her apartment, polishing her badge and rehearsing her testimony, completely unaware that her world was about to change forever. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m. In Judge Marcus Carter's courtroom, justice was about to take on a form that Officer Savannah Mitchell never anticipated. Monday morning arrived, enveloped in a palpable weight of expectation. The courthouse steps buzzed with the usual morning crowd as Officer Savannah Mitchell ascended them two at a time, her boots clicking against the time-worn marble. She had devoted extra effort to her appearance. Her uniform was pressed to military precision, her badge gleamed with a mirror-like shine, and her blonde hair was neatly pulled back into a regulation bun with not a single strand out of place. Several of her colleagues from the precinct were already congregated in the hallway outside courtroom 4B. Sergeant Thompson stood apart from the group, his expression somber as he observed Savannah's approach. "Mitchell," he called out quietly. Savannah checked her watch. There were still 20 minutes before the hearing began. "Sure, Sarge, but make it quick. I want to review my notes one more time." Thompson guided her to a quiet alcove. "Last chance to amend your report if there's anything you want to clarify." "Seriously?" Savannah interrupted him with a laugh that echoed too loudly in the marble hallway. "I appreciate your concern, but my report is flawless. Everything transpired exactly as I documented it." "Even with the video evidence?" Thompson countered. "Videos don't capture everything," Savannah replied, her tone dismissive. "Judge Carter will understand that we have to make split-second decisions in the field. Besides, I've heard he's tough but fair." Thompson's weathered face tightened. "You're not listening." Just then, the heavy courtroom doors swung open and a bailiff emerged. "All parties in Washington versus the city. Judge Carter's court is now in session." Savannah straightened her shoulders and flashed Thompson a confident smile. "Watch and learn, Sarge." Inside, the courtroom filled rapidly. Darnell Washington sat at the defense table alongside his attorney, Marcus Williams. His family occupied the first row behind him. His mother, Patricia, sister Michelle, and several other relatives, dressed formally, their faces composed yet tense. Savannah strode to the prosecution's table, where the city attorney, James Morton, awaited her. He was poring over a thick file, his forehead creased with concern. "Officer Mitchell," he murmured as she took her seat, "I need to know if there's anything in these videos that might contradict your report. Anything at all." "Mr. Morton," Savannah replied, her voice tinged with a hint of condescension, "I assure you." "All rise." The bailiff's voice sliced through the murmured conversations. The Honorable Judge Marcus Carter entered with measured steps, his black robe flowing around him. He was tall, with closely cropped grey hair and dark skin that bore the marks of age in distinguished lines around his eyes and mouth. Those sharp, observant eyes swept across the courtroom as he settled into his seat. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice deep and clear. "We are gathered today regarding the matter of Washington versus the city, concerning an arrest made by Officer Savannah Mitchell on Thursday afternoon. Mr. Williams, you may proceed with your motion." Marcus Williams stood, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss all charges against Mr. Washington and request an immediate investigation into Officer Mitchell's conduct during this arrest. We have video evidence from multiple sources demonstrating that my client was fully compliant and that Officer Mitchell escalated the situation without justification." "Objection," Savannah blurted out, half rising from her chair. Judge Carter's gaze locked onto her. "Officer Mitchell, in my courtroom, objections come from the attorneys, not the witnesses." Mr. Morton, the city attorney, placed a restraining hand on Savannah's arm. "No objection, Your Honor. However, we maintain that the videos do not depict the complete context of the interaction." "We will examine that context thoroughly," Judge Carter replied. "Mr. Williams, present your evidence." Williams nodded to his assistant, who dimmed the lights. A large screen descended from the ceiling, and the first video began to play. It was footage from a bystander's phone, showing Darnell standing quietly by the store entrance, checking his phone. Savannah's approach was visible, her body language aggressive from the outset. "As you can see, Your Honor," Williams narrated, "Mr. Washington was merely waiting for his sister, causing no disturbance when Officer Mitchell approached him without probable cause." "That's not—" Savannah began to interrupt again. "Officer Mitchell." Judge Carter's voice carried a note of warning. "Interrupt these proceedings one more time without being addressed, and I will hold you in contempt. Is that clear?" Savannah's face flushed. "Yes, Your Honor," she managed, though her jaw remained tightly clenched. The video continued, illustrating the escalation exactly as it unfolded. Darnell's calm questions juxtaposed with Savannah's increasingly aggressive responses, culminating in her claim that he made a threatening movement. "Now," Williams said, "let's compare this to Officer Mitchell's body cam footage." The second video started, and Savannah felt her confidence begin to waver for the first time. The angle was different, but the story it told was the same. Worse. Her own voice sounded different than she remembered, harder, more confrontational. "Note the timestamp, Your Honor," Williams continued. Officer Mitchell claims in her report that Mr. Washington exhibited suspicious behavior for several minutes prior to her approach. The video shows she initiated contact within seconds of arriving. Morton shifted uncomfortably beside Savannah. Your Honor, while the timing may be slightly off, we maintain that Officer Mitchell had reasonable suspicion based on the call she received. That call, Williams interjected, we've subpoenaed the dispatch records. The complaint came from a payphone, and when investigators attempted to follow up, they found no one in the area who had actually witnessed any suspicious behavior. We believe Officer Mitchell either fabricated the call or responded to a deliberately false report without proper verification. Savannah's face grew hot. She hadn't anticipated them tracing the call. The truth was, she had seen Darnell from her patrol car and decided he looked out of place. The dispatch call in her report was an afterthought, a detail added to justify her actions. Judge Carter leaned forward. Mr. Morton, does the city wish to respond to this allegation? Morton tugged at his collar. We need time to verify the dispatch records, Your Honor. Very well, Judge Carter noted on his pad. Mr. Williams, continue. The morning proceeded like a slow-motion nightmare for Savannah. Williams systematically dismantled her report, highlighting discrepancies between her written statement and the video evidence. Witnesses came forward, including the store owner who testified that Darnell was a regular customer, Michelle Washington's supervisor confirming their lunch plans, and even a passing jogger who had recorded part of the interaction on her phone. During a brief recess, Morton pulled Savannah aside. "This is bad," he whispered. "You told me you had probable cause. You told me the videos would support your story." "They're just twisting things," Savannah insisted, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "That's what defense attorneys do, right?" Morton stared at her for a long moment. "Officer Mitchell, I'm going to recommend the city settle this case, and if I were you, I'd start thinking very carefully about what you're going to say when Judge Carter calls you to testify." "I'm not lying," Savannah snapped, but the words tasted bitter in her mouth. When court resumed, Judge Carter called Darnell to the stand. Savannah watched as he testified, her perception of him shifting uncomfortably. In her report, she had painted him as aggressive and non-compliant, but the man on the stand was articulate and composed, his account of events perfectly aligning with the video evidence. "Mr. Washington," Williams asked, "had you had any previous interactions with law enforcement?" "No, sir," Darnell replied. "I've never been arrested or even received a traffic ticket. I'm an accountant. I was just waiting for my sister, like I do every Thursday." "And how has this incident affected you?" Williams inquired. Darnell's composure cracked slightly. I used to believe that if you did everything right, followed the rules, and respected authority, you'd be okay. Now I'm nervous every time I see a patrol car. I had to explain to my nieces why their uncle was in handcuffs. How do you explain something like that to children?" From her seat, Savannah heard Patricia Washington stifle a sob. For the first time since the arrest, doubt crept into her mind. She glanced at Judge Carter and found him watching her, his expression unreadable. "Officer Mitchell," Judge Carter's voice cut through her thoughts, "please take the stand." As Savannah walked to the witness box, she tried to recapture her earlier confidence. She had practiced her testimony and prepared her answers, but under the harsh fluorescent lights, with Judge Carter's penetrating gaze fixed on her, those rehearsed words felt hollow. "Officer Mitchell," Williams began his cross-examination, "please explain why you felt Mr. Washington's behavior was suspicious enough to warrant investigation." Savannah swallowed hard. The call stated, "The call we've established came from an empty payphone." Williams interrupted. "Let's focus on what you actually observed." "He was standing near the store entrance," Savannah said, her voice smaller than usual. "It's a high-crime area." "Objection," Williams interjected. "The crime statistics for that neighborhood show it's one of the safest in the city. Would you like me to enter those statistics into evidence?" "Sustained," Judge Carter said. "Officer Mitchell, please stick to your direct observations." The questioning continued, each of Savannah's answers sounding weaker than the last. Williams methodically exposed every inconsistency, every assumption, every moment where her prejudices had colored her actions. "One final question," Williams said. "In your report, you claimed Mr. Washington made a sudden threatening movement, yet in none of the videos, neither the bystander footage, nor your body cam, nor the store security camera, does any such movement appear. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Savannah felt sweat bead on her forehead. The courtroom was silent, waiting for her answer. She looked at Darnell, at his family, at Judge Carter. The weight of truth pressed down on her. I thought he was going to—" She trailed off, unable to finish the lie. "You thought?" Judge Carter's voice was quiet, but resonated throughout the courtroom. "Officer Mitchell, in your report, you stated with certainty that there was no doubt. You wrote it as fact. Are you now saying you were mistaken?" Savannah's voice cracked. "I may have misinterpreted." "May have?" Judge Carter's tone sharpened. "Officer Mitchell, you are under oath. Did Mr. Washington make a threatening movement, or did you lie in your report?" The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, barely audible, Savannah whispered, "No, sir. He didn't move like that. I'm sorry." Judge Carter said, "I don't believe everyone heard you. Please, speak up." Savannah's face burned with shame. "No, Your Honor, Mr. Washington did not make a threatening movement. I wrote what I thought would justify the arrest." The admission hung in the air like smoke. From the gallery, Savannah heard someone gasp. She couldn't bear to look at Thompson or her other colleagues. Judge Carter's voice sliced through the silence that had settled in the courtroom. "Given this admission, we will adjourn for today. Mr. Morton, I expect the city's motion to dismiss all charges against Mr. Washington on my desk within the hour. Additionally, I am ordering a comprehensive investigation into Officer Mitchell's conduct, both in this incident and in any previous arrests she has made." He then turned his full attention to Savannah, who seemed to shrink under his intense gaze. "Officer Mitchell, remain in my chambers. We need to discuss the ramifications of perjuring yourself in my courtroom." As the gallery began to empty, Savannah remained firmly planted at the witness stand. Her carefully constructed world of authority and control had disintegrated, leaving her to confront the stark reality of her actions and herself. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Judge Carter's final words before he retreated to his chambers. "This court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 due. Officer Mitchell, I suggest you spend this time reflecting on the true meaning of the oath you took to protect and serve. This isn't River Creek anymore, and I am not a judge who will turn a blind eye to abuses of power, regardless of who wields that power or what badge they wear." The morning after Savannah's devastating testimony, the courthouse hallways buzzed with hushed conversations. Legal aides hurried past, balancing stacks of files, while reporters clustered near the building's entrance, eager to catch anyone involved in what they had begun referring to as the Mitchell case. Inside Judge Carter's chambers, the morning sun slanted through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across his desk. He sat reviewing the latest evidence submissions, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called, not looking up from the documents. His clerk, Sarah Chen, entered with a fresh stack of papers. "Sir, the investigation team has sent over Officer Mitchell's complete record from the River Creek Police Department." Judge Carter accepted the file, noting its suspicious thinness. "This is everything?" he inquired. "That's what it states, Your Honor," Sarah replied. According to the cover letter, several files were marked as misplaced during a recent system upgrade. "Convenient timing," Judge Carter murmured, making a note in his legal pad. "What about the body cam footage from her training period?" "Technical difficulties, apparently. Most of it is corrupted," Sarah reported. Judge Carter removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Get me Judge Henderson from River Creek on the phone. I want to know if these technical issues affected any other officer records." Meanwhile, in a small conference room down the hall, Marcus Williams sat with Darnell and his family, preparing for the day's testimony. The defense attorney spread several photographs across the table, snapshots from security cameras showing Darnell's regular Thursday visits to see his sister. "These establish your pattern," Williams explained. "Every Thursday for the past year, same time, same place. Officer Mitchell couldn't have had any legitimate reason to consider your presence suspicious." Darnell nodded, but his attention was drawn to another document, Mitchell's incident report. "She wrote that I was lurking suspiciously and behaving erratically," he read aloud, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Who was she seeing when she looked at me? Because it wasn't me." Patricia reached for her son's hand. "Baby, some people see what they want to see." "That's exactly what we're going to prove today," Williams said, pulling out another file. "We have testimony from 6 other individuals Officer Mitchell arrested during her training period. All of them tell similar stories." Across town at the Metropolitan Police Department, Sergeant Thompson sat in Lieutenant Chen's office, both reviewing Mitchell's training evaluations. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with the weight of missed warning signs. "Here," Thompson said, pointing to a note he had made 3 weeks into Mitchell's training, "showed concerning bias in her subject interactions, recommended additional diversity training." Chen frowned. "What was the response?" "Got overruled. Her test scores were too good and we were short-staffed." Thompson's face reflected the burden of that compromise. "We should have pushed harder." "Don't start that," Chen warned. "We're not here to shoulder Mitchell's guilt. We just need to ensure we catch everything." Back in the courtroom, people filed in slowly, the morning's tension palpable. Savannah sat at the prosecution table, her uniform still pristine, but her posture markedly different from the previous day. Gone was the swagger, replaced by a rigid stillness that spoke of sleepless nights and uncomfortable revelations. Judge Carter entered, and the bailiff called the court to order. "Be seated," the judge said, his voice carrying its usual measured authority. "Mr. Williams, you may call your next witness." The defense calls Officer Peter Rodriguez. Savannah's head snapped up as her former training partner walked to the witness stand. Rodriguez avoided her gaze as he was sworn in. "Officer Rodriguez," Williams began, "you worked with Officer Mitchell during her field training, correct?" "Yes, sir, for approximately 6 weeks." "During that time, did you observe any concerning behavior in her interactions with civilians?" Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "I noted several instances where Officer Mitchell seemed to approach situations with preconceived notions." "Could you be more specific?" Williams asked. "There was one case." Rodriguez glanced at Savannah before continuing. "We responded to a noise complaint in the Garden District. Before we even got out of the car, Mitchell had decided it was probably gang-related because of the neighborhood demographics. It turned out to be a kid's birthday party." Williams nodded. "Did you report these concerns?" "I included them in my training evaluations, yes." "And what happened?" "The evaluations were modified before final submission. I was told we needed to focus on her technical proficiency, not subjective concerns." The questioning continued, painting a picture of systematic oversight and ignored warning signs. Rodriguez's testimony was followed by 2 other training officers, each adding pieces to the puzzle of how Savannah's biases had been allowed to flourish unchecked. During a brief recess, City Attorney Morton approached the defense table. "Mr. Williams, a word." They stepped into a quiet corner where Morton spoke in low tones. "The city is prepared to offer a settlement, full dismissal of charges, a written apology, compensation for Mr. Washington, and immediate termination of Officer Mitchell's employment." Williams' expression remained neutral, and the broader investigation Judge Carter ordered. "That's complicated. The department is willing to implement additional training." "No deal," Williams cut him off. "This isn't just about Darnell anymore. You heard the testimony. How many other lives has she affected? How many reports has she falsified? The system that enabled her needs to be exposed." When court resumed, the prosecution called their expert witness, Dr. Angela Martinez, a specialist in law enforcement training and behavioral psychology. She had reviewed all available evidence, including Savannah's background and training records. In my professional opinion, Dr. Martinez testified, Officer Mitchell's behavior shows a clear pattern of confirmation bias and an authority complex, likely stemming from her background and reinforced by inadequate oversight during training. "Could you elaborate?" Morton asked, trying to salvage something from the testimony. Officer Mitchell appears to have entered law enforcement with a rigid worldview about authority and compliance. Rather than having these assumptions challenged and corrected during training, they were effectively reinforced by a system that prioritized technical efficiency over emotional intelligence and community engagement. Judge Carter leaned forward. "Dr. Martinez, in your review of Officer Mitchell's records, did you find any evidence that these issues were identified and addressed during her training?" "Yes, Your Honor, but only at the initial observation level. Several training officers noted concerns, but these notes were consistently minimized or dismissed in final evaluations." The afternoon brought more damaging testimony. A parking attendant from near the convenience store testified about regularly seeing Darnell waiting for his sister. The store owner provided months of security footage showing the same Thursday pattern. Each witness added another crack to Savannah's already crumbling narrative. Finally, Williams called his last witness of the day, Michelle Washington, Darnell's sister. "Miss Washington," Williams began, "please tell us about your Thursday lunches with your brother." Michelle's voice was steady but emotional. "We started having lunch together after our father passed away last year. Dad always said family needs to stay connected, so every Thursday, Darnell would wait for me outside my work and we'd go to lunch. Sometimes we'd just talk about our week, sometimes about Dad. It was our way of keeping his memory alive." "On the day of the incident, I was running a few minutes late because of a patient emergency. I tried to text Darnell, but by the time I got outside..." She paused, composing herself. "By the time I got outside, he was already in handcuffs. I tried to explain to Officer Mitchell that he was my brother and that we did this every week, but she wouldn't listen. She just kept saying he was resisting arrest, but he wasn't. He wasn't doing anything wrong." The courtroom fell silent as Michelle described watching her brother being placed in the patrol car, the helplessness she felt, and the frantic call to their mother. Savannah stared at her hands, unable to look up as Michelle's testimony continued. "Did this incident affect your Thursday lunches?" Williams asked. "We haven't been able to do them since," Michelle admitted, tears finally spilling over. "Darnell won't come to that area anymore. We tried once last week, but he had a panic attack just parking his car. Officer Mitchell didn't just arrest my brother that day. She took something precious from our family." As Michelle stepped down from the witness stand, Judge Carter called for the day's final witness, Detective Sarah Martinez from Internal Affairs. "Detective," Judge Carter addressed her directly, "what has your investigation revealed about Officer Mitchell's prior arrests?" "Your Honor, we've identified 13 arrests during her training period that show patterns similar to Mr. Washington's case. In each instance, the initial cause for contact was questionable, and the situation escalated primarily due to Officer Mitchell's approach and attitude. The body cam footage from these incidents, most of it is unavailable, sir, either not properly uploaded or corrupted in the system. However, we've located civilian recordings of 3 incidents that directly contradict Officer Mitchell's written reports." Judge Carter's expression darkened. "And who was responsible for maintaining these records?" "That's where it gets complicated, Your Honor. The chain of custody shows multiple handlers, unclear protocols, and a pattern of technical glitches that seem to affect certain officers' footage more than others. The implications of systemic issues hung heavily in the air." Judge Carter made several notes before addressing the courtroom. "We'll adjourn for today. Tomorrow morning, I want to hear from the department's record supervisor and IT manager, Detective Martinez. Please ensure they have full documentation ready regarding these technical issues and chain of custody protocols." As people began filing out, Savannah remained seated, the weight of the day's revelations visible in her posture. Her confident facade had crumbled entirely, replaced by a growing understanding of the damage she had caused. Judge Carter watched her for a moment before speaking. "Officer Mitchell," he said. She looked up, startled. "I expect you back here tomorrow morning. There are still questions you need to answer." "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. In the gathering dusk outside the courthouse, 3 conversations took place simultaneously. In his chambers, Judge Carter spoke quietly with his clerk about subpoenaing records from River Creek. In the parking lot, Darnell hugged his sister, both finally allowing themselves to hope for justice, and in a dimly lit stairwell, Sergeant Thompson found Savannah sitting alone, her head in her hands. "Mitchell," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes red. I never meant." "I know," Thompson replied, sitting beside her. "But meaning to hurt people and hurting them anyway, sometimes that's worse because it means you didn't even think enough about them to consider how your actions would affect their lives." The truth of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket in the growing darkness. Officer Savannah Mitchell began to understand that the true measure of authority wasn't in how much power you could wield, but in how carefully you wielded it. Dawn broke over the city courthouse, painting the stone facade in shades of amber. Inside his chambers, Judge Marcus Carter sat reviewing a stack of newly acquired documents, his morning coffee growing cold beside him. Each page seemed to add another layer to what had started as a simple case of police misconduct. A knock at his door preceded Sarah Chen's entrance. "Your Honor, the files you requested from River Creek arrived overnight." Carter accepted the thick manila envelope, noting the expedited delivery stamp. "Judge Henderson came through?" "Yes, sir. She also included a personal note." Sarah handed over a sealed letter. Carter read it quickly, his expression darkening. "She says there's been pressure to restrict access to certain records." "Interesting timing." He placed the letter in his desk drawer. "What about the IT manager's report?" "Mr. Phillips is waiting outside with Detective Martinez. They found something you need to see." The judge nodded. "Send them in." James Phillips, the department's IT manager, entered alongside Detective Martinez. Phillips was a nervous man in his 50s, clutching a laptop to his chest like a shield. Detective Martinez's calm presence seemed to steady him as they took their seats. "Mr. Phillips," Carter began, "I understand you've discovered some irregularities in the department's digital records." Phillips glanced at Martinez before speaking. "Yes, Your Honor. After your order to investigate the missing footage, I did a deep dive into our storage systems. The corrupted files weren't random glitches." He opened his laptop, adjusting the screen to reveal a complex array of logs. Someone accessed these files using administrative credentials. The corruption was not a mere malfunction, it was intentional. They employed a program specifically designed to corrupt certain video segments while preserving the metadata intact. "Can you determine who accessed the files?" Carter inquired. "That's where it becomes intricate." Phillips scrolled through the logs, noting that the credentials belonged to Captain Robert Drake, yet the access patterns did not align with his typical usage. Someone else was utilizing his login. Carter's eyes narrowed. "And where is Captain Drake at this moment?" "On administrative leave," Martinez replied. "He has been for 3 months, officially due to stress-related health issues." "Convenient," Carter murmured. "Mr. Phillips, how far back do these corrupted files extend?" "At least 18 months, Your Honor. And it's not just Officer Mitchell's footage. We've identified similar patterns with several other officers, all of whom have had multiple civilian complaints lodged against them." The weight of the implications hung heavily in the air. Carter made several notes before looking up. "Detective Martinez, I require a comprehensive list of every officer whose footage was impacted. Mr. Phillips, prepare a detailed report on the technical aspects of this tampering. We will need both for today's hearing." As they exited, Sarah Chen returned with another update. "Sir, there's a reporter from the City Times seeking a comment. The story regarding evidence tampering has leaked." Carter sighed. Tell them no comment until after today's proceedings. And Sarah, ensure we have additional security in the courtroom. Across town, in a modest diner far removed from the courthouse, Sergeant Thompson sat across from Lieutenant Chen, both nursing cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. How deep do you think this issue goes? Chen asked quietly. Thompson glanced around the nearly empty diner. Remember last year when Internal Affairs attempted to implement that new body camera review protocol? Chen nodded. It got shut down, citing budget concerns. They claimed budget had nothing to do with it, Thompson replied. They were fearful of what they might uncover. Thompson pulled out his phone, showing Chen a series of emails. I've been maintaining records, Lisa. Every time I reported concerns about an officer, every complaint that was buried, every technical issue with the footage. Why didn't you come forward sooner and report it? Chen pressed. To whom? The same individuals who were burying the evidence? Thompson's voice carried years of frustration, but now with Judge Carter involved. Chen scrutinized her old friend's face. You're going to testify? Someone has to, right? The disease is merely a symptom. Back at the courthouse, the morning session commenced with an unusual tension in the air. The gallery was filled with numerous journalists among the spectators. Savannah sat at the prosecution table, appearing smaller than ever in her uniform. Judge Carter entered, his expression serious. Before we proceed, I want to address some new developments in this case. Mr. Williams, Mr. Morton, he said, motioning for the attorneys to approach the bench. As they stepped forward, Carter spoke in hushed tones. Gentlemen, given the evidence of systematic tampering with police records, I am expanding the scope of this hearing. Mr. Morton appeared uneasy. Your Honor, my instructions from the City Council need to be reassessed in light of this new evidence. Carter interrupted him. I'm granting you 1 hour to consult with your superiors. This is no longer solely about Officer Mitchell. When the attorneys returned to their tables, Carter addressed the courtroom. Detective Martinez, please take the stand. Martinez was sworn in, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to the nervous energy that filled the room. Detective, Carter began, please share your findings regarding the department's handling of digital evidence. Martinez outlined the technical details that Phillips had uncovered, explaining how the selective corruption of footage had created blind spots in oversight. As she spoke, Savannah seemed to shrink further into herself, realizing she had been a small piece in a much larger puzzle. And what about Officer Mitchell's cases specifically? Carter inquired. We have reviewed all 13 cases previously identified, Martinez replied. In each instance where footage was corrupted, we discovered civilian recordings that contradicted the official reports. Additionally, we have uncovered 27 more cases exhibiting similar patterns during her training period. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Savannah's head snapped up, shock evident on her face. She had been unaware of many of these incidents her training officers had managed while she observed, learning their methods. Your Honor? Williams stood. Given this new evidence, the defense moves to add several witnesses to our list, individuals from these newly discovered cases. Granted, Carter replied. Mr. Morton, the city attorney, looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, the city requests a brief recess. Denied, Carter interrupted. Detective Martinez, please continue. As Martinez detailed the pattern of misconduct, a larger picture emerged. It wasn't merely about one rookie officer's prejudices. It was about a system that had fostered and protected those prejudices. During the lunch recess, Savannah found herself alone in a courthouse bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. The door opened, and she looked up to see Michelle Washington's reflection in the mirror. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Michelle broke the silence. Did you know? Savannah turned, water dripping from her chin. Know what? About the others. The other individuals whose lives you and your colleagues ruined. Did you know? Savannah's voice was barely a whisper. No, I mean I knew some things weren't right, but I thought... She trailed off, realizing how hollow any explanation would sound. Michelle's voice was steady but filled with controlled emotion. You know what the worst part is? Every Thursday, I look out my office window at lunchtime. Every single Thursday. And every time I anticipate seeing my brother standing there, checking his phone, waiting to hear about my day. But he's not there, and he might never be there again. She turned to leave, but then paused. Officer Mitchell, whatever transpires in that courtroom, I hope you remember that moment when you decided my brother didn't deserve to be treated like a human being, because we will never forget it. When court resumed, Sergeant Thompson took the stand. His testimony exposed years of ignored warnings and buried complaints. It wasn't just Officer Mitchell, he explained. The department had an unofficial policy. Certain officers were protected. Their body cam footage would conveniently malfunction. Civilian complaints would vanish into the system, and anyone who raised concerns was quietly pressured to back off. "And why are you coming forward now?" Williams asked. Thompson's eyes found Savannah's. "Because sometimes you must decide what kind of cop you want to be, one who upholds the law or one who hides behind it." As the afternoon wore on, more witnesses came forward. A parade of civilians shared stories eerily similar to Darnell's, routine encounters that escalated due to officer prejudice, reports that misrepresented events, complaints that disappeared into the bureaucratic void. Judge Carter listened to each testimony, occasionally glancing at Savannah, observing as the weight of revelation settled on her shoulders. She had entered his courtroom believing she was defending her authority. Now she was witnessing the collapse of everything she had been taught to believe about that authority. Late in the afternoon, an unexpected witness appeared. Captain Robert Drake himself, accompanied by his attorney. "Captain Drake," Carter addressed him, "I understand you've reached an agreement with the district attorney's office?" "Yes, Your Honor," Drake replied, his voice weary but resolute. "In exchange for immunity, I am prepared to testify about the department's handling of misconduct complaints and digital evidence." What followed was a devastating account of systematic corruption. Drake detailed how certain officers were selected for protection, how evidence was manipulated, and how whistleblowers were silenced. "Officer Mitchell," he stated at one point, "was precisely the kind of rookie we sought. Ambitious, authority-oriented, and willing to adhere to the unwritten rules. We paired her with training officers who would reinforce those tendencies." "And the missing records from River Creek," Carter prompted. "We had contacts there. When we learned about this hearing, we reached out and requested them to minimize certain aspects of her record." As Drake's testimony continued, Savannah felt the last pieces of her worldview crumbling. Every certainty she had held about her role, her authority, her place in the system, all of it was built on a foundation of corruption and prejudice. Judge Carter called for a brief recess before the day's final witness. In the hallway, Darnell Washington stood with his family, listening to their attorney explain the broadening implications of the case. "This isn't merely about your arrest anymore," Williams told them. "Judge Carter is going to use this case to enforce a complete overhaul of the department's oversight systems." "And Officer Mitchell?" Patricia Washington asked. Williams glanced toward where Savannah sat alone on a bench, staring into space. "She's a small piece of a larger problem, but sometimes it takes a small piece to bring down the entire structure." When court resumed, Judge Carter addressed the packed gallery. "Given today's revelations, this hearing will be expanded into a full investigation of departmental practices. Mr. Morton, I understand the City Council has requested time to prepare a formal response." "Yes, Your Honor. They are prepared to announce a complete review of all affected cases and implement new oversight procedures." Affected cases and implement new oversight procedures. "That is insufficient," Carter replied firmly. "I am appointing a special master to oversee this investigation. Every case involving corrupted evidence will be thoroughly reviewed. Every officer mentioned in Captain Drake's testimony will be scrutinized, and every victim of this systemic abuse will have their opportunity to present their case in court." He turned to where Savannah sat, looking disoriented in her now wrinkled uniform. "Officer Mitchell, while you are not solely accountable for this institutional failure, you are not absolved of your actions. I am ordering your immediate suspension pending a comprehensive review of your conduct. Additionally, you will be required to participate in the investigation, sharing everything you know about these practices." Savannah nodded numbly, fully aware that her career in law enforcement was effectively over. "As for Mr. Washington's case," Carter continued, "all charges are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Williams, you may file your civil suit at your convenience. The evidence presented here will be preserved for those proceedings." As the judge prepared to adjourn the session, Savannah suddenly stood. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Carter studied her for a moment before giving a brief nod. Savannah turned to face the Washington family, her voice trembling but gradually gaining strength as she spoke. "I'm truly sorry, not just for what I did to Mr. Washington, but for everything I represented. I believed that authority meant never having to question oneself. I realize now that I was wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for that mistake." Judge Carter let her words linger in the air before delivering his final statement. "This court is adjourned until Monday morning, when we will begin examining the full scope of this misconduct. I remind everyone present that this investigation is ongoing, and all evidence must be preserved." As people filed out of the courtroom, Savannah remained standing, watching as Darnell and his family left together. Michelle's words echoed in her mind. Every Thursday, she thought, finally grasping the true weight of what she had done, not just to one family, but to countless others whose stories were only now coming to light. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Judge Carter observed from his chamber window as reporters gathered, knowing that tomorrow's headlines would tell only part of the story. The real work, the slow, painful process of rebuilding trust and accountability, was just beginning. Rain drummed against the windows of the precinct's records room as Savannah hunched over a computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m., but she barely noticed. She had been there for hours, diving deep into public records, news archives, and any database she could access. Her target, Judge Marcus Carter. Her desperation had driven her here after 3 sleepless nights. The investigation was dismantling everything she had built, everything she believed in. But if she could find something, anything to discredit the judge, it might change everything. A news article from 35 years ago caught her attention. The headline made her pause. "Local teen cleared after 3 months in detention." The grainy photograph showed a much younger Marcus Carter being embraced by his parents outside a courthouse. Savannah leaned closer, reading intently. According to the article, 17-year-old Marcus Carter had been wrongfully arrested for a convenience store robbery, despite multiple witnesses placing him at a school event during the crime. He had spent 3 months in juvenile detention before being exonerated. Her phone buzzed, a text from Kevin Nash, a journalist she had contacted earlier. "Got your message. Meet me at Riverside Diner in 20. Savannah glanced at the time and then back at the article. "On my way," she typed back. The diner was nearly empty when she arrived, the fluorescent lights harsh against the rain-streaked windows. Nash sat in a corner booth, laptop open, coffee cooling beside him. He looked younger than she expected, probably fresh out of journalism school and eager for his first big story. "Officer Mitchell," he greeted her, eyes bright with anticipation. "You said you had something on Judge Carter?" Savannah slid into the booth, pushing a thumb drive across the table. "His juvenile record was sealed, but I found newspaper coverage." "Did you know he was arrested as a teenager?" Nash's fingers hovered over his laptop keys. "That's public record. What makes it newsworthy?" "Think about it," Savannah pressed. "A judge who was wrongfully arrested as a teen is now presiding over cases involving police misconduct. How can he be impartial?" "You think he's biased against law enforcement because of his past?" Nash asked, raising an eyebrow. "I believe the public deserves to know about potential conflicts of interest." The words felt rehearsed and hollow. Nash was already skimming through the files. "This is interesting, but it's thin. We'd need more to make it a story." What if I told you there were rumors about his time in juvenile detention, things that didn't make it into the official record? Savannah hesitated, knowing the next words would cross a line. I heard he might have been involved in some violence while he was inside. Nothing proven, but... Nash's expression shifted subtly. That's a serious allegation. Any evidence? Not yet, but if you start digging... You're asking me to imply that a sitting judge has a violent past based on unsubstantiated rumors? Nash closed his laptop. Officer Mitchell, I may be new, but I'm not foolish. This feels like a hit piece. The public has a right to the truth, she countered. Not to manufactured scandals, he shot back, gathering his things. For what it's worth, I hope you find a better way through this. Savannah watched him leave, the rejection stinging more than she anticipated. But she wasn't finished. She had other contacts, other journalists who might be more willing to pursue the story. By morning, she had made 3 more calls, each ending similarly to her meeting with Nash. However, her last contact, a blogger known for controversial takes on local politics, showed interest. "Send me what you have," he said. "No promises, but I might be able to work with this." Savannah emailed him the files from the precinct computer, adding her own anonymous source quotes about concerns regarding the judge's objectivity. Her hands shook as she hit send, fully aware that she was committing career suicide if she were caught. Yet she felt trapped, desperate for any means to undermine the investigation's credibility. She didn't expect things to move so swiftly. By noon, the blog post was live. Exclusive. Judge Carter's hidden past. Can we trust his judgment? The piece was sensational, implying dark undertones to Carter's juvenile detention stay and questioning whether his past had created a vendetta against law enforcement. The story spread through social media like wildfire, picking up embellishments with each share. Local news stations began calling the courthouse for comments, while protesters from police support groups gathered outside, demanding that Carter recuse himself from the investigation. Judge Carter was in his chambers when Sarah Chen brought him the printouts of the escalating scandal. He read them silently, his expression unreadable. "Should we issue a statement?" Sarah asked. "No need," Carter replied calmly. "Have the staff inform everyone that court will begin 30 minutes early tomorrow, and Sarah, make sure Officer Mitchell is notified." The next morning, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Journalists filled the back rows, cameras ready. Savannah sat rigidly at the prosecution table, trying to ignore the knowing looks from her colleagues. Everyone seemed to suspect where the leaked information had originated. Judge Carter entered precisely at 8:30 a.m. The usual all-rise call felt charged with extra tension. "Be seated," Carter commanded, his voice carrying its usual measured authority. "Before we continue with our investigation, I would like to address the recent media attention regarding my personal history." A rustle of anticipation swept through the gallery, and Savannah held her breath. 35 years ago, I was wrongfully arrested for a crime I didn't commit. I spent 3 months in juvenile detention before being exonerated. These facts are public record, though someone has recently attempted to embellish them with unsupported allegations. He paused, his gaze sweeping the entire courtroom. What isn't public record is what I learned during those 3 months. I learned how it feels to be powerless in a system that presumes guilt. I learned that authority without accountability is nothing but institutionalized bullying, and I learned that justice delayed is often justice denied. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Those lessons shaped my career choices. That's why I became a public defender before joining the bench. That's why I am known for being thorough in examining evidence, and that's why I will not recuse myself from this investigation. His eyes found Savannah's. Someone hoped that by exposing my past, they would discredit this investigation. They failed to understand that my experience doesn't make me biased against law enforcement. It makes me uniquely qualified to recognize the difference between proper police work and the abuse of power. Savannah felt herself shrinking under his gaze, understanding too late the magnitude of her mistake. "Now," Carter continued, "let's discuss how these sealed juvenile records were accessed and who provided them to certain media outlets." The IT manager, Phillips, was called to testify first. He detailed the unauthorized database searches conducted from the precinct's records room computer at 2:17 a.m. Using Savannah's login credentials, the next witness called was Kevin Nash, the young journalist who testified regarding his meeting with Savannah at the diner. His testimony was followed by emails from other journalists she had contacted, each one documenting her attempts to plant the story. Finally, the blogger who published the piece was summoned to testify. Under oath, he admitted to embellishing the narrative based on suggestions from Savannah, including unsubstantiated claims about violence that she had alluded to but never explicitly stated. As the evidence accumulated, Savannah felt the last remnants of her professional reputation disintegrating. She had crossed a line, violated ethical boundaries, and for what purpose? To discredit a judge whose only offense was pursuing truth and accountability. During a brief recess, she found herself face to face with Judge Carter in a quiet corridor. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice carrying more sadness than anger. "I thought if people questioned your objectivity—" "You thought wrong," Carter interjected. "Do you know what I remember most from my time in detention? Not the fear, not the isolation. I remember Officer James Wilson, the guard who noticed I was reading law books in the library. Instead of mocking me like the others, he brought me more books and said that if I was going to study law, I should understand all sides of it. He taught me that wearing a badge doesn't inherently make someone good or bad. It's how they wield the authority that comes with it." Savannah felt tears welling up. "I just wanted to protect my career." "No," Carter replied quietly. "You wanted to protect your illusions about what that career meant. There's a significant difference." When court resumed, Carter addressed the attempt to discredit him directly. This court will not be influenced by attempts at character assassination. However, Officer Mitchell's actions in accessing sealed records and attempting to plant false narratives reveal a disturbing pattern of ethical violations. This will be added to the ongoing investigation into her conduct. The remainder of the day brought more revelations about departmental corruption, but Savannah barely registered them. She was lost in thought, reflecting on her own journey from an idealistic academy graduate to someone who would attempt to destroy a man's reputation to protect a flawed system. Late that afternoon, as the session was concluding, an elderly man entered the courtroom. Judge Carter's face displayed rare surprise. "Officer Wilson," he said softly. James Wilson, now well into his 70s, smiled from the gallery. "I've been following the case in the papers, Your Honor. I thought you might appreciate a friendly face today." Carter's composure cracked slightly. "The court will recess for 15 minutes. In his chambers, Carter and Wilson shared a brief but emotional reunion. Savannah, watching through the doorway, finally understood what true authority looked like. It wasn't about power or control. It was about impact, about the ripples one person's actions could create across decades. When proceedings resumed, Wilson remained in the gallery, a living reminder of how single acts of kindness or cruelty could shape lives forever. Judge Carter concluded the day with a statement that would be quoted in news articles for weeks to come. 35 years ago, I was a teenager in detention, convinced that the system was irredeemably corrupt. One person showed me that within any system, no matter how flawed, there are individuals striving for positive change. Today, we are not just investigating misconduct. We are creating an opportunity for positive change. How we utilize that opportunity will define us far more than any mistakes in our past." The words hit Savannah like a physical blow. She thought about Darnell Washington and all the others whose lives she had impacted. She had tried to destroy a good man's reputation to protect her own, only to discover that his past made him not weaker, but stronger. more qualified to assess her actions and their consequences. As people filed out of the courtroom, Wilson stopped beside her. "You know," he said quietly, 35 years ago, I saw another young person allowing fear and pride to drive them into making poor choices. Want to know what I told him?" Savannah looked up, surprised. "What?" "That it's never too late to choose a different path, that one mistake or even a multitude of mistakes doesn't have to define your entire story." He glanced toward Carter's chambers. "He proved me right. Maybe you will too." The rain had ceased by the time Savannah left the courthouse. The setting sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the steps. She paused, looking back at the building where her attempts at deception had transformed into a lesson about truth, justice, and the long arc of consequence. Her phone buzzed, a message from Marcus Williams scheduling her deposition for the civil suit, another step in the lengthy process of accountability that lay ahead. But for the first time since the investigation began, she felt something beyond fear and desperation. She felt hope, not for escaping consequences, but for the possibility of redemption through truth. The pounding on Savannah Mitchell's door came at 6:15 a.m. She was already awake, sitting at her kitchen table with an untouched cup of coffee, when she heard the authoritative voice, "FBI, open the door." Her hands trembled as she complied. 4 agents in dark jackets entered, their badges gleaming in the early morning light. The lead agent, a woman with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes, presented the warrant. "Officer Savannah Mitchell, you are under arrest for tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law." As they led her out in handcuffs, Savannah noticed her neighbors watching from behind curtained windows. Her cruiser sat in the driveway. She wouldn't be driving it again. Across town, similar scenes played out at other addresses. Captain Drake, despite his immunity deal, was taken into custody for additional charges uncovered during the investigation. 3 training officers were arrested, and even the IT manager, Phillips, was brought in after evidence suggested he had been more involved in the cover-up than he had admitted. In his chambers, Judge Carter reviewed the federal arrest warrants. U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen, no relation to his clerk, sat across from him, explaining the scope of the federal investigation. "The evidence tampering wasn't isolated to your jurisdiction," she explained. "We found similar patterns in departments across 3 states. Your case broke it open." Carter studied the files. "The River Creek connection?" "Exactly. Officer Mitchell's former department was the key, once we started pulling those threads." Chen spread out a diagram showing links between multiple police departments. "It's a network. They share techniques, technology, even personnel." "How long has this been under investigation?" Carter inquired. 8 months. We were building our case slowly until your investigation forced their hand. The blog post attempting to discredit you spooked some of our targets. They started making mistakes." A knock interrupted them. Sarah Chen entered with urgent news. "Your Honor, federal agents just raided the precinct. They're seizing all the computer equipment and files." Carter nodded. "Ensure today's hearing is moved to the federal courthouse and contact Mr. Williams. His civil case just became much larger." At the FBI field office, Savannah sat in an interrogation room, still trying to process the morning's events. The door opened, and the lead agent, who had introduced herself as Special Agent Monica Torres, entered with a thick file. "Let's talk about River Creek," Torres said, taking a seat. "Specifically about what happened there before you transferred." Savannah's throat went dry. "I don't know what you mean." Torres opened the file, removing a photograph that depicted a younger Savannah with several River Creek officers, including a man Torres identified as Lieutenant James Cooper. "Cooper has been running this network for years," Torres explained, identifying officers with the right mindset, training them in evidence manipulation, report fabrication, selective enforcement, and then placing them in departments across the region. "I never," Savannah started. "Never what? Never knew about the network, or never thought you'd get caught?" Torres laid out more photographs. We have everything, Officer Mitchell. The training sessions disguised as poker nights, the software used to corrupt video evidence, the database of preferred candidates for recruitment. Savannah stared at the evidence of a conspiracy she had been part of without fully comprehending its scope. I thought it was just about protecting officers who were doing their job. Is that what you told yourself? Torres's voice was surprisingly gentle. Arresting people without cause, falsifying evidence, violating civil rights. Was that just doing your job? In another interrogation room, Phillips was breaking down. They approached me right after I was hired, he confessed. They said if I wanted to keep my job, I needed to be a team player. It started small, just occasional video files that needed to disappear. Then they wanted me to install their software. Captain Drake, despite his earlier immunity deal, found himself facing new federal charges. His attorney sat grim-faced as U.S. Attorney Chen outlined the evidence, linking him to the larger conspiracy. Your immunity covered departmental misconduct, Chen explained. It doesn't extend to federal crimes. We have emails, financial records, travel documents, all showing your role in expanding this network. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as local media caught wind of the raids. Judge Carter's expanded investigation had transformed into something much larger. In the main courtroom, now packed with federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and journalists, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. U.S. Attorney Chen addressed the court. What began as an investigation into one officer's misconduct has exposed a systematic effort to subvert justice across multiple jurisdictions. This network identified and recruited officers who displayed a willingness to abuse their authority. They provided tools and training for evidence manipulation, created cover stories for civil rights violations, and actively worked to discredit anyone who threatened to expose their activities. Darnell Washington and his family sat in the gallery, watching as their personal injury case transformed into a landmark civil rights prosecution. Marcus Williams had already filed motions to expand their lawsuit into a class action representing dozens of victims across multiple jurisdictions. During a brief recess, Williams met with the Washingtons in a conference room. "This changes everything," he explained. "The federal investigation has uncovered evidence of a coordinated effort to violate civil rights. Your case helped expose it, but now we're looking at systematic abuse going back years." Gripping her son's hand tightly, she felt a surge of hope. "All those other families, we will finally have a chance at justice," Williams reassured her. "The FBI has been diligently building this case for months, and Judge Carter's investigation has only accelerated their progress." Back in the interrogation room, Savannah found herself at a crossroads. Agent Torres had laid out her options: cooperate fully and immediately, or face the maximum federal charges. "Why me?" Savannah asked, her voice trembling. "I was just a rookie." "You were their ideal recruit," Torres replied. "Young, ambitious, and already conditioned to view authority as absolute. They spotted you in River Creek, facilitated your transfer here, and ensured you were trained by their people. You weren't merely a rookie, you were an investment." The words struck Savannah like physical blows. Every choice she believed she had made had been meticulously orchestrated. The details of her transfer, her training assignments, even her early solo patrol that led to Darnell's arrest, all planned to solidify her position within their corrupt system. "If I cooperate," she said slowly, "I need to know something first." "What?" Torres inquired. "How many?" Savannah's voice cracked. "How many people did they hurt using officers like me?" Torres opened another file. "We have identified over 300 cases so far across 15 departments, and those are just the ones we can substantiate." Savannah thought about Darnell Washington and multiplied his experience by 300. The weight of that realization felt like it was crushing the air from her lungs. "I'll tell you everything," she whispered. By late afternoon, Judge Carter's courtroom had been transformed into a command center for the federal investigation. U.S. Attorney Chen presented the preliminary findings. The network operated like a pyramid scheme for civil rights violations, she explained. Senior officers identified recruits who exhibited promising signs, excessive force complaints, patterns of racial profiling, and resistance to oversight. These recruits were mentored, trained in evidence manipulation, and eventually placed in positions to recruit others. Judge Carter listened intently as Chen detailed how the conspiracy spread. They created a shadow training program where official records showed proper procedure, while select officers were instructed in how to falsify reports, manipulate body camera footage, and handle civilian complaints. They even developed a scoring system where officers earned points for successful arrests that wouldn't withstand proper scrutiny. The afternoon brought a parade of cooperating witnesses. Phillips provided technical details about the software used to corrupt video evidence, while training officers described how they identified potential recruits. Even Captain Drake, facing federal charges despite his earlier immunity deal, began sharing information about the network's hierarchy. However, it was Savannah's testimony that truly captivated everyone's attention. She described her recruitment in River Creek, the subtle ways they tested her boundaries, and the gradual normalization of misconduct. They never called it corruption, she explained, her voice steady despite her evident distress. It was always framed as maintaining authority or supporting fellow officers. They made it seem noble, like we were protecting the thin blue line between order and chaos. As she spoke, Judge Carter noticed Darnell Washington and his family in the gallery. Their personal tragedy had sparked an investigation that would affect hundreds of lives. The judge made a mental note to acknowledge their role when he issued his final ruling. The day's most dramatic moment came when Agent Torres presented evidence linking the conspiracy to several high-profile cases of police misconduct in other cities. "This isn't just about individual officers," Torres testified. "This is a coordinated effort to prevent accountability and maintain systems of oppression under the guise of law enforcement." Savannah listened from the witness stand, each revelation deepening her understanding of how thoroughly she had been manipulated. The idealistic rookie who believed she was maintaining order had been a pawn in a much darker game. During the final hour, U.S. Attorney Chen outlined the next steps. "We've secured search warrants for 23 additional locations. Federal agents are collaborating with state prosecutors to review every case handled by identified network members, and we're establishing a task force to manage the anticipated influx of civil rights cases." Judge Carter addressed the courtroom before adjourning. "What began in this court as an examination of one arrest has exposed a cancer in our justice system. The coming days will be challenging for everyone involved, but sunlight remains the best disinfectant. This court will continue to work with federal authorities to ensure that every victim of this conspiracy receives justice." As federal marshals led the arrested officers away, Savannah caught a glimpse of Sergeant Thompson in the gallery. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw not condemnation, but a profound sadness. He had tried to warn her, to guide her toward a different path, but the conspiracy's influence had been too overpowering. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps as U.S. Attorney Chen held a press conference. Cameras flashed as she announced the formation of a special joint task force to investigate police corruption. In his chambers, Judge Carter met privately with the Washington family and their attorney. "Your strength in pursuing justice hasn't just helped your own case," he told them. "You've given hope to hundreds of other families who have suffered similar injustices." Darnell, who had remained quiet throughout much of the day's proceedings, finally spoke. "What happens next?" "Justice," Carter replied simply. "Slow but certain. Every case will be reviewed, every victim will be heard, and those responsible will face consequences for their actions." As evening fell, Savannah was returned to federal custody. In her holding cell, she contemplated the road ahead. Cooperation would mean testifying against former colleagues, exposing more corruption, and facing the consequences of her actions. But for the first time since her arrest, she felt something akin to peace. Agent Torres visited her one last time before her transfer. "Why did you agree to cooperate?" Torres asked. "You could have tried to negotiate for a better deal." Savannah thought about Michelle Washington's words in the courthouse bathroom, about Judge Carter's story of redemption, and about the 300 lives impacted by the conspiracy. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "the only way to make things right is to tell the whole truth, no matter what it costs you." As her cell door closed, Savannah Mitchell, former officer, conspiracy member, and now key witness, began the long process of making amends. The system that had shaped her into a tool of oppression was crumbling, and within its ruins lay the possibility of real justice. The next morning's headlines would tell part of the story. Federal investigation uncovers multi-state police corruption network. But the real narrative of justice delayed but not denied, of truth emerging from darkness, and of redemption through accountability was still being written, one testimony at a time. The high-security courtroom of the federal courthouse buzzed with tension as Savannah Mitchell took the witness stand. 6 weeks had passed since the FBI raids, and she had spent every day preparing for this moment, the commencement of federal prosecution against the police corruption network. U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen approached the podium. "Ms. Mitchell, please tell the court about your first meeting with Lieutenant Cooper at River Creek." Savannah's voice was steady, her police uniform replaced by a simple grey suit. "It was after my third shift. He invited me to what he called a mentorship meeting at his house. There were other officers present, all carefully selected." "What transpired at these meetings?" Chen inquired. "They began with subtle discussions about maintaining authority and protecting fellow officers. Then they introduced what they referred to as practical techniques for handling difficult situations. Could you be more specific?" Savannah took a deep breath. "They taught us how to write reports that would justify any action we took, how to describe civilian behavior to make it appear threatening, which words to use, and which details to emphasize." In the gallery, Sergeant Thompson watched as his former rookie outlined the conspiracy's methodology. Each revelation underscored how thoroughly they had corrupted the fundamental principles of law enforcement. "These weren't merely informal suggestions," Savannah continued. "They had actual training materials, templates for reports, lists of approved phrases, even sample scenarios we would practice." Chen displayed a document on the courtroom screens. "Is this one of those templates?" "Yes," Savannah confirmed. "See how it's structured. The civilian is always described as aggressive or non-compliant first, and then our actions are presented as responses to their behavior, never the other way around." Throughout the morning, Savannah detailed the network's operations. She described how Cooper and others identified potential recruits, how they tested loyalty through increasingly questionable assignments, and how they created a parallel training system that twisted proper procedures into tools of oppression. During a brief recess, Judge Carter met with federal prosecutors in his chambers. Agent Torres spread out new evidence on his desk. "We've linked the network to similar operations in 12 states, she reported. "Same methods, same training materials, same pattern of evidence manipulation. They were building a nationwide system." Carter studied the documents. "How many officers are involved?" "A conservative estimate would be over 500, and those are just the active participants. There are probably twice as many who knew, but remained silent." The afternoon session brought Phillips to the stand. The former IT manager had turned state's evidence, providing technical details about the network's digital operations. "The software wasn't just for corrupting video," he explained. "It was designed to create plausible technical failures. If someone investigated, they'd find what appeared to be genuine file corruption or system errors." "Who provided this software?" Chen asked. "It came through Cooper, but it was developed by a private company called Blue Line Security Solutions." Phillips paused. "A company owned by retired police officials from multiple departments." The revelation sent ripples through the courtroom. The conspiracy hadn't merely corrupted active officers, It had created a profitable business model for perpetuating that corruption. As Phillips testified about technical details, Savannah sat with federal marshals in a secure room, watching on closed-circuit TV. Each piece of evidence illustrated how small her role had been in a much larger machine. During her next session on the stand, Chen directed her attention to specific cases. "Tell us about Jeremy Torres," Chen prompted. Savannah's composure faltered slightly. 19 years old, I arrested him for suspicious behavior near a convenience store. The same store where I later apprehended Darnell Washington. "What transpired with Mr. Torres?" she asked. "He spent 3 weeks in jail before the charges were dismissed, lost his job, and his girlfriend was pregnant at that time. He missed their first ultrasound appointment because he was in custody." "Was there any valid justification for his arrest?" Savannah's voice caught as she replied, "No, he was merely present, but he fit the profile we were instructed to target, young minorities in what they labeled a high-value enforcement zone." In the gallery, Marcus Williams sat alongside several other civil rights attorneys. They had been compiling similar cases, constructing a massive class action lawsuit that would ultimately encompass over 300 plaintiffs. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Cooper's former secretary, who had secretly documented years of dubious meetings and conversations. They referred to it as quality control, she testified. "Every week we would review body camera footage from officers across multiple departments, not to check for misconduct, but to identify officers who exhibited potential for recruitment. They looked for specific behaviors, attitudes towards civilians, and a willingness to escalate situations." The evidence mounted. Financial records indicating payments to Blue Line Security Solutions, training schedules disguised as routine departmental meetings, and performance evaluations that rewarded aggressive enforcement while disregarding civilian complaints. During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to portray Savannah as an opportunist, turning against her colleagues to save herself. However, her testimony remained unwavering, and her remorse appeared genuine. "Yes, I am testifying in exchange for consideration in sentencing," she acknowledged. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because people were harmed, hundreds of people, and remaining silent would make me complicit in every future abuse that this system enables." As the day's session concluded, Judge Carter made an unexpected announcement. "Tomorrow this court will hear from those most affected by these actions. The prosecution will present testimony from citizens whose lives have been impacted by the network's operations." The following morning, Jeremy Torres was the first to take the stand. Now 21 and a father to a toddler daughter, he described how his wrongful arrest had derailed his life. "I lost my job at the warehouse," he testified. 3 weeks in jail with no communication with my employer. By the time I was released, they had replaced me. My girlfriend's family wanted her to leave me. They believed there must have been a reason for my arrest. Even after the charges were dropped, people viewed me differently." One by one, victims shared their narratives. A nurse who lost her license after a falsified drug arrest, a college student whose scholarship was revoked, and a small business owner whose reputation suffered due to manufactured charges of disorderly conduct. Savannah forced herself to listen to each testimony, absorbing every detail of how the system she had served had shattered lives. During a break, she encountered Jeremy Torres in a courthouse hallway, accompanied by federal marshals. He studied her for a long moment. "You really didn't see us as people, did you?" "No," she admitted quietly. "We were taught to view threats, statistics, and quotas, never individuals with lives, families, and dreams. And now I see it all too clearly, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." The prosecution's case concluded with testimony from civil rights experts who outlined the broader social impact of targeted enforcement and systemic bias. They presented data illustrating how the network's operations had disproportionately affected minority communities, creating cycles of distrust and fear. In her closing argument, U.S. Attorney Chen addressed the larger implications. This case isn't merely about corrupt officers or manipulated evidence. It's about the deliberate distortion of justice itself. The defendants didn't just violate the law, they systematically undermined the very principles of equal protection and due process. The jury's deliberations lasted 3 days, and when they returned, the verdicts were unanimous, guilty on all counts for Cooper and the other conspiracy leaders. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month. For Savannah, the most challenging moment came after the verdicts when she met with Marcus Williams and his clients to formally apologize. "I know words aren't enough," she told them, "but I want you to understand that every day for the rest of my life I will work to repair the damage I helped cause." Williams nodded. "That work begins now. The civil case needs your testimony regarding specific incidents, policies, and patterns of behavior. It won't be easy." Savannah squared her shoulders. "Whatever you need." The civil proceedings brought a different kind of reckoning. Where the criminal trial had focused on the conspiracy's leaders, the civil case exposed the daily impact of their policies. Savannah testified for weeks, detailing how seemingly routine police actions had been weaponized against innocent civilians. During a break in the civil proceedings, she met with her therapist, Dr. Sarah Reynolds, a counselor specializing in law enforcement trauma. "How are you handling the testimony?" Reynolds asked. Savannah stared out the office window. "Every day, I learn about another life I helped destroy, another family traumatized, another community's trust shattered." "And how are you processing that?" Reynolds inquired. "I'm not sure I should be allowed to process it," Savannah admitted. "Maybe carrying this weight is part of making amends." "Punishment and redemption aren't the same thing," Reynolds reminded her. "You can acknowledge your guilt while still working toward healing, both for yourself and those you harmed." The civil case concluded with a landmark settlement. The departments involved agreed to significant reforms, including independent oversight, mandatory bias training, and a civilian review board with real authority. The class action plaintiffs received substantial compensation, although everyone recognized that money couldn't fully repair the damage done. Judge Carter presided over the final settlement hearing, and his closing remarks would be quoted in law schools for years to come. Today, we've seen justice served in terms of legal remedy, but true justice requires more than verdicts and settlements. It necessitates a fundamental change in how we perceive authority, accountability, and human dignity. The officers involved in this conspiracy didn't begin their careers intending to become corrupt. They were gradually led down that path by a system that prioritized power over service and control over protection. As we implement these reforms, we must remember that the badge is not a shield from accountability, but a symbol of public trust. In the aftermath, Savannah began collaborating with police reform advocates, sharing her experiences to help identify and prevent similar corruption. She spoke at academy training sessions, her story serving as a powerful warning about the seductive nature of unchecked authority. 1 year after the initial investigation, she was invited to speak at a community reconciliation forum. The audience included many of her former victims, including Darnell Washington and his family. "I won't ask for forgiveness," she told them. "What I did, what we all did, caused harm that can never be fully undone. Instead, I ask for the opportunity to help prevent others from suffering the same injustice. Every day, I work with departments and training programs to recognize and stop the patterns that enabled our abuse of power." Michelle Washington, who still couldn't bring herself to wait outside her office, asked the hardest question: "How do we know this won't happen again?" "Because now we know what to look for," Savannah replied. "The subtle ways authority can be corrupted, the small compromises that lead to bigger ones, the importance of true accountability, but most importantly, because people like your brother had the courage to stand up and demand justice, no matter the cost." Darnell, who had finally resumed his Thursday lunches with Michelle at a different location, added his perspective. The system didn't fail just because of corrupt officers. It failed because good people remained silent. Change occurs when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. The forum concluded with the announcement of a new civilian oversight committee, led by community members and reform advocates. Sergeant Thompson, who had retired from the force to focus on police reform, served as a technical advisor. As the anniversary of Judge Carter's initial ruling approached, the changes were evident. Body camera footage was automatically uploaded to secure independent servers, civilian complaints were investigated by an outside agency, and training programs emphasized de-escalation and community engagement. However, the most significant change was invisible, a shift in how authority was perceived and exercised. Officers learned to view their power not as a right, but as a responsibility, while communities began to cautiously rebuild trust with law enforcement. Savannah's sentencing, delayed due to her cooperation and testimony, finally arrived. She stood before Judge Carter one last time, having played a crucial role in dismantling the corrupt system she had once served. Carter reviewed her contributions to the investigation before speaking. "Ms. Mitchell, your actions caused real harm to real people. No amount of cooperation can erase that fact. However, your efforts to expose and reform the system that enabled that harm have been substantial. This court sentences you to 5 years, with 3 years suspended, plus 5 years of supervised release. During that time, you will continue your work with reform advocates and training programs." As she was led away to begin her sentence, Savannah caught a glimpse of Officer James Wilson in the gallery, the man who had once shown Judge Carter a different path. He nodded slightly, acknowledging that even in the depths of corruption, there was always a chance for light to break through. The story of one rookie officer's journey from blind authority to conscious accountability became part of a larger narrative about justice reform and the ongoing work of building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. It wasn't a happy ending. There was too much damage for that, but it was something equally crucial: a new beginning.